talk about brands, and brands have been kind of front and center as part of these controversies around the world. And I think there's this sense that it's not only the right thing to do, but also it's what Gen Z and so on requires from their brands. And, seeing the brands more of a lifestyle brand. And so I think there's certainly kind of this shift. On one hand, the compliance expectation. And in the United States, companies are having to adapt very quickly to this new normal of sorry, it's a privilege to import. And if you want to import, these are the new rules of the game. And they're given very little lead time for the most part in some industries to get there. And on the other hand, it being, like I mentioned, just external pressures with brands kind of moving in that direction for a number of different reasons, all kind of packaged within a broader kind of ESG push.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. This is your host, Gwen Hassan, and I'm very excited today to have a new guest, Richard Mojica. He is the practice lead for customs, import, and trade at Miller Chevalier. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Gwen.
So let's start out with a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about your background, your practice areas. I know you started your legal career working for customs. Is that correct?
Yes. I started my legal career at U.S. Customs headquarters in the office that issues regulations and rulings to companies on various topics related to the importation of merchandise into the United States. Now, in my current role, I help companies comply with all types of U.S. import regulations, including the ones that we're going to talk about today.
There's no shortage of them. Yeah.
Exactly.
So could you, for those who don't know, and I think there's probably quite a few of listeners who are just learning now about kind of the fact that they should be concerned about customs rules as it relates to compliance generally and to human trafficking specifically. Could you talk a little bit about the overlap between customs and human trafficking prevention? And did it really all start with that repeal of the presumptive or consumptive demand clause, or is that too broad of a statement to make?
Yeah, happy to give some background on that. One thing to keep in mind is there have been two times in my career that customs related issues have been what I refer to as kind of above the fold, New York Times articles.
Yeah.
And one of those was over the past couple of years, the implementation of these tariffs on China origin products, that it became a true CEO issue and still is. And the other one is this concern of forced labor in a company's U.S. supply chain and seeing how the government has taken an interest in enforcing the law around it. So as background, there's a U.S. law, Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930, that prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor. And for decades, that law had a big loophole known as the consumptive demand clause, which you just mentioned, which in effect allowed the importation of goods made with forced labor if the good was not sufficiently produced in the United States to meet consumptive demand. So for whatever reason, this loophole existed, and it had the effect of simply that customs really was not enforcing it.
I mean, that's a heck of a loophole from a philosophical standpoint, right? We don't want anything made with forced labor unless we don't have enough of it here. Then
Exactly.
It's okay for us. I mean, that's so strange.
Exactly. I think it was more driven by, let's focus on getting the materials that we need, especially in, for example, a time of war. In that regards, the law was outdated. And over the past several years, we've had this shift where social compliance, social responsibility has become a bigger part of the compliance function, about like what people care about.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what drove a change in the law. And so in 2016, another law was passed that plugged that loophole. And ever since, CBP has been charged with enforcing that law. And roughly since about 2019 or so, CBP has been very active in its enforcement of the law. What this means generally is that there's a mechanism, a tool called Withhold release orders. These are instructions to CBP at the ports of entry to detain merchandise that is suspected of being made with forced labor. And so as of right now, there are about over 50 WROs in place covering a variety of different products from a number of different countries, although mostly from China. In 2022, for example, there were 5 new WROs. And so far, there's been over 1,000 shipments detained associated with those WROs. And if you look at kind of years past, like these numbers are nowhere close. There's been a very significant uptick in enforcement, and we expect that it's going to continue to grow.
So that leads really nicely into kind of the focus of our conversation today, which is what I heard someone refer to actually in another program as the UFLPA, which cracked me up. I thought, the what? The Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which goes into effect next month. Could you give us an overview of what that requires and what corporations need to be aware of as it relates to the UFLPA?
Sure. I'm going to call it the UFLPA.
Okay.
But yes, so at a high level, the UFLPA mandates that the U.S. government develop a strategy to ensure that goods made with forced labor in China generally, and in China's Xinjiang region specifically, are prevented from importation into the United States. So one thing to keep in mind is the Xinjiang or XUAR region produces a lot of very important raw materials that are used in a number of different products. So, for example, it said
like
that
cotton,
exactly
silicone.
About 20% of the world's cotton and an estimated 80% of the cotton from China comes from that region.
Oh, wow.
The majority of the world's polysilicon supply that's used to produce solar panels and other products, as well as other agriculture products. For example, there are tomatoes, minerals, oils, and other products that are used in manufacturing, say, auto parts, electronics.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the law says that there's now a rebuttable presumption that anything made in this region has been made with forced labor.
Right.
Yeah? Okay.
So this law has, in my mind, I've kind of boiled it down to 3 key components, starting with what you just mentioned. The law creates a new rebuttable presumption that all goods made in whole or in part in the Xinjiang region are made with forced labor and are therefore prohibited from entering the United States. And it not only includes products that are made in the XUAR, but also by entities that have been identified by the U.S. government as having certain connections to forced labor in the region. So it's possible that it's still within China, but outside of the Xinjiang region. I think that's an important distinction, which essentially it kind of expands the scope of the reach of the law. And on this rebuttable presumption, the law mandates that CBP start enforcing this rebuttable presumption within 180 days of the law's enactment, which is June 21st. So it's coming up. And so I mentioned there are 3 kind of key components. I would say that's the first one. And the other 2 relate to the same thing, which is the strategy. As part of the law, the U.S. government, by way of an interagency task force that is chaired by the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has to develop an enforcement strategy to prevent goods made with forced labor in China from entering into the United States. So the law makes it clear that the strategy must identify the entities, the products, and the sectors that are at high risk of being implicated with alleged forced labor, and an enforcement strategy for each. Okay. So it's very prescriptive in terms of like what the U.S. government has to do. And the third piece of this is not only does it give that responsibility to the government, but it also says you need to give guidance to importers, which is what importers have been kind of clamoring ever since this uptick in enforcement activity started about 2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
And the guidance to the importers generally kind of falls into 2 buckets. One is supply chain due diligence. What do importers need to do to ensure that their supply chains are free from forced labor? That's one. And then the other goes to the evidentiary burden. What is the type, nature, and extent of evidence that importers must submit to U.S. Customs to demonstrate that their goods were not made with forced labor?
Well, that's probably the key takeaway that I want to give people, which is if the presumption is rebuttable, then how do they rebut it? With what? Do they need to have mapped their entire supply chain I hesitate to use the term risk-based because you and I have talked about this before. There's so many in the compliance community who have followed a model that is a risk-based model that says, hey, it's okay, like under the DOJ guidance, to put your eggs in the high-risk basket and to focus only on the things that really present a high risk for your particular operation or location. With this, there is no idea of a risk-based program, right? It is kind of approximating a, strict liabilities idea, right? Which is, hey, if it comes from here, we're going to block it no matter what. And then if there's a connection to it, we're going to block it no matter what. And now it's on you to figure out how to convince us that it should be released. So how does the manufacturer go about that? What is going to be enough to rebut a presumption?
The short answer to that is that we still don't know. And the importing community has high hopes that as a result of this, of the law and the guidance that the U.S. government must provide, there's going to be more clarity around it. I'm a bit skeptical of that. I don't know to what extent the guidance is really going to give the importing community the clarity that it needs. So instead, in working with companies, we've been encouraging them to take steps that make sense for them and that aim for a high standard, and then to tweak according to the guidance that the government will issue at some point, according to the statute before June 21st.
I was just about to ask if it's guidance that's supposed to help. When is it coming? Any rumors you're hearing over there?
Well, yeah, we've heard from CBP directly that it will come prior to June 21st, but we don't know exactly when.
The 20th at midnight.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know. But I think it's because there have been some industries that have been under scrutiny for the past year and a half or so. There are a lot of kind of good lessons learned so far that we think are going to inform this process. So the apparel industry, given the focus on cotton, the solar industry, given the emphasis on polysilicon, the rubber gloves industry, the palm oil industry, tobacco products, all of these industries have had kind of a front row view into kind of how the government is working these cases. And as have we, for example, in helping companies challenge detentions and build their compliance programs. And I can tell you kind of just based on that, so I mentioned earlier that when CBP detains merchandise under a WRO, the company's given 3 months to prove that the merchandise is not made with forced labor. And as you said, given the lack of guidance, it's a task that really means proving the absence of forced labor. But what that has meant practically so far is that companies have to collect two types of documents. One bucket is what we call the traceability documentation, which is this is documentation that includes transactional, transportation, production records that show the origin of the imported product and its high-risk inputs, kind of going all the way back upstream. So if it's solar panels, you're going all the way up to the silicon metal.
To the mine,
To the mine. If it's a T-shirt, you're going all the way back to the cotton. That's the theory of it. And having mapped the supply chain, the term that you used earlier, which relates to identifying all the suppliers in your U.S. supply chain, you then collect the documents that ideally put the puzzle together, right? So you should be able to connect it through purchase orders and production records to show that this input was in fact used to make that product that was presented for importation. So of course, a daunting task, but that is one piece. That's the traceability component. And then there's a supplier due diligence component to this. And this is to show that these suppliers that you have identified in mapping your supply chain are not involved in forced labor. Companies can take different approaches to evaluate that risk and to present the results of that evaluation to customs. So some companies have relied on adverse media screening. There are a number of different companies that use software to screen non-Western platforms for adverse media. There's the use of the traditional due diligence platforms that are used kind of more for the FCPA context, Dow Jones, Dun & Bradstreet, Hoover's to look at family trees. When there's been a concern about the presence of the XBCC or another blacklisted entity, screen against those lists and so on. So that's one level of diligence that can be performed. And then when there is additional concern stemming from one of those, for example, when there's the media screening yields some results that are concerning, some companies have taken kind of additional step, right? These are the heightened risks. So can you commission an investigative report? Can you conduct other types of supplier engagement? For example, preemptively conducting some type of internal audit or gathering the traceability
On-site
documentation,
inspection of
something like that, something like that. And someone who knows the situation and is listening would say, yeah, but if it's in Xinjiang, nowadays you can't conduct these type of audits. Yeah, that's right. But nonetheless, many times, as I mentioned, this is something that hasn't affected only Xinjiang, but merchandise made, materials made in provinces outside of Xinjiang that have some alleged connection to an entity with a connection to Xinjiang. So the connections that have led to detentions are sometimes attenuated. So there tends to be some room to investigate and at times argue that there is no such connection in the supply chain.
What do you think about the use of outside audit firms? I think about the Top Glove case. And if you recall, I think they had an outside audit firm that had given them an A rating, a year before. They ended up having that channel, I can't remember which channel it was in the UK, that did the kind of investigative journalism, and found all kinds of retention of identification documents and huge amounts of overtime and, substandard working conditions. And then the next audit report that came out gave them a D. Separated by a year. So can you rely on an outside firm? Is it to the place now where that's not enough to use a local firm to audit?
That's an interesting question. I mean, Customs has certainly posed that question. And I think that a simple answer here could be that an audit report is not enough and that you generally have to put an audit report in the context of kind of the other due diligence activities that the company does. Again, I think sometimes it's kind of hard to get comfortable with the idea that an audit report is not enough. But I think what we'll start to see, and we're already seeing, is auditors becoming more sophisticated in this space and conducting audits that are more tailored to the U.S. government's expectations. And I'll give you an example. One of the benchmarks that the U.S. government uses to evaluate whether there is forced labor in a supply chain or in a factory specifically is they evaluate whether any of the 11 indicators of forced labor, the ILO indicators, are being violated. And so I've been in a situation where we've had to commission reports and that put together kind of the evidence going factor by factor to demonstrate that there is evidence that none of the 11 indicators are threatened or are at issue. So I think what we've seen is understanding that this is the framework that Customs cares about. Auditors are adapting their audit framework to ensure that when reporting out, they report the findings consistent with this 11 indicator framework.
They're linking back to those indicators as a clear way of demonstrating a lack.
Exactly.
The proof of the negative, have you said? Yeah, that is somewhat reassuring to me because if you're sitting in-house somewhere in the U.S. and you're trying to figure out how to audit a location that's in rural China where you don't have anybody local who doesn't speak the language, who in the middle of COVID may or may not be able to travel there or get approval to travel there, the reliance on an outside party becomes important.
Right.
Yeah. The fact that there seems to be a movement towards becoming more sophisticated in their audit offering is helpful. That gives me a little bit of reassurance. Where do you think this fits overall? And when I say this, I mean the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act as part of the human rights focus that we're moving towards generally. I mean, we're seeing the new acts that are coming out of Europe, the new diligence requirement for human rights due diligence. Do you see this as part of a groundswell that will move towards more transparency and more focus on true stakeholder impact of business? Or do you see this more as the U.S. government making an effort to at least do something, but not having fully committed to maybe where Europe's at in terms of their goals?
That's an interesting question. And I think one interesting aspect of the U.S. legislation and the enforcement effort is that this whole thing started in earnest during the Trump administration and has carried over to the Biden administration. And perhaps it's a cynical way to look at it, but the Trump administration, this was one of the levers that it was pulling to decouple the U.S. supply chain from China. So there was tariffs, export controls, investment restrictions, and there was this. And this pressure around human rights has certainly caused companies to reconsider, reshuffle their supply chains, even when just not wanting to be associated with anything related to a violation of human rights, certainly modern slavery. But it has carried over and has been adopted by the Biden administration because it very much aligns with the Biden administration's overall trade policy and just policy in general, right? The trade policy is one that it's rooted in a worker-centric mentality, worker-centric policy. And so this kind of fits nicely, kind of the race to the top and protecting worker rights around the world. So that's an aside. From the company perspective, which is where I hear it the most, I think companies are preparing for this to be not the U.S. not to be an anomaly, but rather the compliance expectations associated with this U.S. enforcement effort are very much aligned with what they're expecting from Europe, Canada, and from other jurisdictions. And there's this clear sense that it's just a matter of time until all of these countries somewhat align and the same requirements are adopted kind of across the board.
Yeah. So it will stop being the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act and we'll end up with kind of more international consensus around fighting human trafficking and forced labor in general, requiring true, mapping of your supply chain and knowing where you're getting your stuff from and how the inputs are made, and making sure too that the company isn't inadvertently creating kind of a perverse incentive for forced labor through its sourcing, activities.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's also a change in the company mentality. It's also changing the consumer mentality, right? Talk about brands, and brands have been kind of front and center as part of these controversies around the world. And I think there's this sense that it's not only the right thing to do, but also it's what Gen Z and so on requires from their brands. And, seeing this brand's more of a lifestyle brand. And so I think there's certainly kind of this shift. On one hand, the compliance expectation, and in the United States, companies are having to adapt very quickly to this new normal of it's a privilege to import. And if you want to import, these are the new rules of the game. And they're given very little lead time for the most part in some industries to get there. And on the other hand, it being, like I mentioned, just external pressures with brands kind of moving in that direction for a number of different reasons, all kind of packaged within a broader kind of ESG push.
Yeah, and kind of reaching a critical tipping point, if you will, in a Malcolm Gladwell kind of a way to push everything forward from multiple sides. You got the regulatory side, you've got kind of you said the Gen Z public swell of disapproval side, and they're meeting along with an ESG push to kind of coalesce at a really interesting moment in time.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I think it's good. So final thoughts here. Where should somebody start if they're learning about this now and thinking, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin? I mentioned briefly that risk-based approach might not work here, but there is something to be said for kind of a matrixed risk approach, right? I mean, you still have to figure out where your goods are. And if you've got connections to China, is that the best place to start?
Yeah, I think even though, going back to a point that you raised earlier, yes, you are right that the way that the U.S. government has been talking about the enforcement of this law is not more like a strict liability, that there's no de minimis exception. You have to know where all your inputs come from, period. That's certainly the message that the U.S. government has put out, and I've heard from several CBP officials when talking about the matter. So it is a departure from kind of the other compliance rubrics of let's focus on risk-based approach and the big baskets. Exactly.
Yeah.
So if they haven't already, companies with supply chains involving China, which I think are the biggest risk, you should do two things. I mean, one is to map their U.S. supply chain, the products that they import to the United States. Again, it's an exercise that involves identifying the upstream suppliers for a certain product and the origin of those inputs. Mm-hmm. And then the second point is conducting due diligence on those suppliers to determine the risk of enforcement. And the level of due diligence, I think, is going to vary. And this is where the risk matrix that you mentioned comes into play. It makes sense to have a risk segmentation approach, notwithstanding what we just were talking about 2 seconds ago, so as to categorize the known suppliers into various risk categories based, for example, on their location, the type of product produced, whether there's any concern, for example, adverse media that makes a supplier higher risk than not, and deciding how you're going to structure the due diligence around your suppliers so that the ones that fall into higher risk you're conducting additional steps for those, and you have a baseline that you conduct for the ones that have a lower risk. But as part of all of this baseline is now higher than it was before.
Yeah. That water level has raised.
The water level has raised. Exactly. Because the expectation of the way of doing business, and it has changed. That's the bottom line.
All right. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Richard. As we wait on the edge of our seats for guidance, when it comes out, how can people find you and talk to you if they would like more advice or help about complying with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the guidance that we hope will be coming any minute? How do they get in touch with you?
Thank you for that. I've been very active on LinkedIn, actually. Been posting what the firm has produced, the client alerts on this issue, and we've been writing quite a lot. Great. And I've been posting it all on my LinkedIn as well as some additional thoughts on this. So anyone who wants to connect with me, happy to do so.
Thank you very much.